I hope this is a novel that they can't put down about a woman they can't forget. I hope it teaches something to them about a period that they may not have lived through, or they may have lived through and seen through different eyes. And then I hope that it is yet another reminder, as I said before, that we need to do a better job of caring for our veterans.
Hello, everyone. I'm Haley Lerner, Associate Producer for Arts and Culture here at GBH, and I'm thrilled to be hosting tonight's Beyond the Page with Kristin Hannah. It is my great pleasure to welcome a masterful storyteller tonight to Beyond the Page, the award-winning and best-selling author Kristin Hannah. With over 20 novels under her belt, including the unforgettable masterpiece The Nightingale, Kristin Hannah has solidified her place as a literary powerhouse. The Nightingale soared to unprecedented heights, earning the esteemed title of Goodreads Best Historical Fiction Novel for 2015 and securing the prestigious People's Choice Award for Best Fiction. Its timeless tale captured the hearts of millions worldwide, earning accolades from industry giants like Amazon, iTunes, BuzzFeed, The Wall Street Journal, Paste, and The Week. Reese Witherspoon herself selected it for her acclaimed book club in 2023, further cementing its status as a modern classic. In 2018, Hannah's literary prowess shone once again with The Great Alone, an instant New York Times #1 bestseller, and the recipient of Goodreads' coveted title of Best Historical Novel of the Year. Continuing her streak of literary triumphs, The Four Winds stormed onto the scene in February 2021, immediately claiming the top spot on numerous bestseller lists, including the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, USA Today, and indie bookstores. This tale captivated audience and earned the esteemed recognition of being selected as a book club pick by both the Today Show and the Book of the Month Club, which held it as the pinnacle of literary achievement for 2021. Hannah's literary prowess extends beyond the written page, with her works making a significant impact in the realm of film and television. The Nightingale is currently in production at TriStar with Dakota and Elle Fanning, poised to bring its characters to life on the silver screen. Additionally, TriStar has secured the rights to adapt The Great Alone, further testament to the enduring appeal of Hannah's storytelling. On the small screen, Hannah's beloved novel Firefly Lane has captivated audience as the #1 Netflix series worldwide, starring Katherine Heigl and Sarah Chalke. With season 2 poised to conclude the series, Hannah's narrative legacy continues to enthrall audiences across various mediums, reaffirming her status as a literary luminary of our time. Tonight, we have the privilege of delving into the world of this literary force, getting exclusive insight into Hannah's writing process, your favorite novels of hers, and a sneak peek into her latest release, The Woman, as she answers your questions in just a bit. Now, without further delay, please welcome to Beyond the Page, Kristin Hannah. Hi, thanks so much for joining me.
Hi, Haley. Thank you. It's so great to be here.
So happy to have you. I have lots of questions, and I'm sure our audience does as well. I encourage the audience to please submit your questions. I'll go ahead with a few, but to start, how does it feel to have your newest book, The Woman, out in the world now?
It's amazing. It's always kind of a hold your breath moment when something, finally comes out after years worth of work. But it's been just amazing, to see the response to this book, and I'm hearing from so many female vets and their families, and it's just really a kind of a bright moment in my career, actually.
Mm-hmm. What made you decide to write this specific book and tell this story?
Well, I was a child during the Vietnam War, and so it made, a really big impact on me. And my best friend at the time, I was in about 3rd grade, her father was a pilot who went to Vietnam, and he was shot down. And in those days, we wore what were called prisoner of war bracelets. And it had the serviceman's name and the date that he was lost on it. And you wore that in remembrance until he came home. And so I wore this bracelet for decades because he never came home. And so his presence was sort of always with me as a reminder of the war. And then I saw how vets were treated when they came home. And it was always something that I wanted to write about. And in fact, in about 1997, I pitched a book about Vietnam to my then editor, who had been at Berkeley in 1968, actually. And she said, you're not ready. The world's not ready. Wait until you are. And so I really took that to heart, and I did. I waited, and I kept thinking to myself as the years passed, like, am I ready? Is the world ready? Can I write this book? And it wasn't until March of 2022, and I was in the middle of lockdown. I live in Seattle, and we were locked down for the pandemic. And I was seeing sort of how angry and divided and chaotic the world was at that time period. And it made me feel it reminded me of the Vietnam era a little bit. And then in watching the news, I saw our nurses and our doctors, sort of on the front lines of this pandemic, sacrificing so much of themselves for us. And it just all came together at that moment. And I thought, this is my moment. I really want to write about the nurses who served in Vietnam.
Yeah, that's fascinating. In many of your books, and like this one, you focus on female characters in the height of historical events. What made you specifically want to focus on the woman who served in Vietnam?
Well, like I said, ever since, I guess since I started Nightingale, maybe a few years before Nightingale, I have really been sort of obsessed with lost women's historical stories. And I think it's maybe, turning 50. I'm not exactly sure what made me turn my attention to that, but I just began to realize that there were so many stories and times and places that I had been taught about, but I didn't know anything about what the women were doing. And, that started with World War II and the Nightingale, and then continued, through the Great Depression and the Four Winds. And so it made perfect sense that when I decided that I was finally ready to write my Vietnam story, it made perfect sense that I looked for the female angle and, the story of the women. And it's so interesting. And if for people who have read the book, it was shocking to me in doing the research how little women were remembered, even by people who ought to know better, by the VA, by other vets, And so I'm really, really honored to be able to sort of shine a light on their heroism and their service.
Mm-hmm. The main character in this book, Frankie, she chooses herself to go fight in the war. What made you want to make a character that, chooses to fight? What is the motivation behind how you made her as your main character?
Well, Frankie really is like many of my characters, but Frankie specifically is drawn from the research. There are some remarkable nurses' memoirs written about Vietnam. I've listed a few of my favorites in the back of the women. But they all kind of, or not all of them, of course, but a lot of them sort of shared a similar profile. They were young, they were patriotic, they came from patriotic families, they believed in duty, they believed in service. They were nurses, most of them with very little experience. And so, they went to war and did it to make their parents and their country proud. And of course, once they got there, war was not what they were expecting, as I don't think it can ever be. They were, in many cases, woefully unprepared. And that is sort of how, Frankie began to take shape.
Yeah, as this is a history-driven novel, what type of research were you doing for this? And, is there a specific process that you typically do for your books?
I mean, I love the research phase. I think partially I love it because I'm working, but I'm not actually writing. And so it's this beautifully immersive time where I'm quite relaxed trying to, pull my story together. And I began the research here like I do almost all of my research. I start with the big picture, what was going on in the world, what was going on politically, socially. You have this very interesting period, the 60s, that are, that follow the conservative, conformity-loving 1950s. and then, move into a very different political and social landscape in the 60s. So I was trying to learn, all about that. And then, I get to the Vietnam and the Vietnam War and the nurses period, and that's all very focused research on, one of the reasons I picked a one woman viewpoint, one woman story, is so that I could really sort of contain the amount of research and the sprawl of the story. And I didn't have to take on all of Vietnam or all of America or all of the time period. I just was able to give you one woman's life, and her life was very representative of the women who served. Oh,
Yeah,
and it's the memoirs, I'm sorry. It's the memoirs that really give the novel its shape and turn it into what it's going to be.
yeah. I saw that, that you were able to actually meet some of the women, that fought and that at the Vietnam Women's Memorial on Veterans Day. Can you tell me a little bit about this experience and how it felt for you? Was it full circle for you?
It was really pretty life-changing, I think, in a lot of ways. So in writing the book and in researching it, I realized at some point after probably writing the first draft, which is about the 2-year mark of this process, I realized I needed someone who had actually been there to really vet this, to make sure that I was accurate, that I was authentic, that I was not offending anybody, or, that I wasn't making mistakes. And so I tracked down a woman named Diane Carlson Evans, who had been a nurse in Vietnam herself. She has written an amazing memoir of her experience there called Healing Wounds. And I just loved this book. So I tracked her down and asked if she would help me. And I was fortunate in that she had read the Nightingale. And so I think she, knew I was the real thing, that I really would have a novel. And that began, I think, what's become really a friendship and a relationship. She read several versions of the book and also, passed me on to helicopter pilots and donut dollies, Red Cross workers, surgical nurses. And, she really sort of helped me. And so when she invited me to the 30th anniversary of the Women's Memorial in Vietnam, in Washington, D.C. last November, I really jumped at the chance. And that was when I really got to meet, there were probably 100 of these, they call themselves sister veterans there, standing in front of their memorial, which Diane had founded, and talking about their experiences. And it was moving and inspiring, and I just life-changing, like I said. And that's when I really understood the importance that this book could have in remembering these women and in starting a conversation about them.
Why do you think it's important to tell these types of stories? For these untold stories of women like this, what do you think it does for, the families of people like this, or people that might not know, why do you think it's important to continue making sure these stories are told?
I think that being seen and being remembered is just of critical importance to all of us as human beings. And in fact, I was at one of my events, I believe in New York City, a week or two ago, and a woman came up to me and was speaking to me afterwards. And she said, I come from a Gold Star Vietnam family, and we have been grieving in silence for 40 years. And she's like, I can't tell you what it means to be able to say with pride, my dad was a Vietnam vet who was killed, and so I think that, and one of the whole points of this book and the whole points of Frankie's journey within it is that remembrance matters. And especially when we are asking other Americans to serve in wars on our behalf and sacrificing themselves and their families for us. I think it really behooves us to not only care for them correctly when they come home, but to remember and show gratitude for their service.
Did you come out of this writing process with a newfound understanding of veterans and, something that you think you didn't really know before or have the same level of understanding?
This has been sort of my issue for a very long time. I've written about PTSD. I've written about returning veterans. I've written about women being underappreciated in the military in books like Homefront before. And so this is something that I feel very, very deeply about. But even having said that, even after all the research, like I said, I was really surprised at the level at which the Vietnam vets, and I think a lot of female vets across the board, feel unseen and unappreciated.
Mm-hmm. So you've written both contemporary and historical fiction. What about specifically historical fiction like this book? What draws you to that genre, and what do you think is rewarding about the process of writing historical fiction books?
I have a long history as a geek girl. I'm an old Lord of the Rings. I can't wait for Dune. I love all the big fantasy world building novels. And that's what I grew up on. And so I think what I particularly love about historical fiction is the level of world building. You might have been to Paris, but you haven't been to Paris during the war or my Paris during the war. And so I am able to go in and I think really visually try to render an era in a way that you feel as if you're there.
Yeah, it's almost like a sense of time travel.
It is in a way. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So you've just had such critically acclaimed work, as we mentioned before. You've seen your work turned into TV shows and, they're in movie productions. What's that like for you?
Well, I've only had one actually come to the screen. I mean,
Yeah.
the Nightingale has been in development, in pre-production, for more than a decade now. And so I can tell you that it's a long and it's a process that requires a lot of patience to do this sometimes. But seeing Firefly Lane on the screen was surreal and wonderful and powerful. And I'll never forget when I went up to Vancouver and saw them filming and met the crew for the first day and everything. I didn't realize until I walked on set that in describing my character's house in 1973 in Snohomish, where I had lived, I didn't realize like I had used my house and my bedroom. And so here I walk on the set and it was like walking into my 13-year-old bedroom. And so that was really kind of a cool moment.
Wow, so it sounds like they really, honored your writing. It was so specific to that. How much of a process did you have being involved in that series?
To be honest, I was not really involved at all. I spoke to them in the beginning and I told them what was important to me and what I hoped they would do. But the truth of this process is when you hand something over like this, you hand it over and it becomes someone else's, and someone else's vision, carries the day. And so you hope that their vision aligns with yours and that they honor the material and the message. But I don't think you ever really know unless you are willing to dive into the process and actively take part. And I was just never willing to do that.
But one next question is, where did you get your beginning in writing? What started this journey for you that led to so many books and so many, stories that people love?
Well, so it all started a long, long time ago when I was in law school, young, and my mother was dying of breast cancer. And she was, in the hospital, and I was visiting her one day, and I started complaining about something, and she said, you really don't need to worry about that. You're going to be a writer anyway. And it was such a stunning comment and observation because I had never, ever shown any interest in writing. And so we kind of started talking and arguing, actually. And she said, let's write a book together. And I said, okay. And she loved historical romance. So we said, okay, let's write a historical romance novel. And so every day after school, I would go to the library and Xerox whatever pages I could come up with that related to this story that we were planning. And then I would sit, at her bedside, and we talked about this and kind of plotted this story. And it was just a really lovely bonding moment, I think, for the last months of her life. And then after she passed away, I had no interest in being a writer. So I put all that information in a box and put it in my closet and, went back to life and started practicing law, got married, got pregnant. And when I was pregnant, I had a tough pregnancy. So I was in bed from 14 weeks on. And I knew then that I wanted to be an at-home mom. And so I pulled out this box of stuff from my mom and thought, okay, I'm going to give this writing a try and see how that works. And I guess the rest is history.
Yeah, that's an amazing story. It's unbelievable. Where did you get these ideas for each of your books? I mean, what makes you decide this is the thing I'm going to focus in on? Because I can imagine there are so many books you'd love to write in your head.
There are. For me, that is far and away the hardest part, like choosing an idea. Although making any kind of a decision, frankly, is not my strong suit. And it's taken a long time. I've had several ideas, like The Women and The Four Winds, and a book called Winter Garden. They were ideas that I wanted to do for years. But mostly I have to sort of sit down and find the thing that I guess that it obsesses me to a point that I'm willing to live it, eat it, breathe it, sleep it, for a long period of time. And something that I think I have something to say about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so right now I'm going to shift to a couple of the audience questions. We have some that are people are very eager to know. Charlene asked, did you get to visit Vietnam while doing your research?
The Vietnam Wall or Vietnam?
Vietnam.
Oh, I did not, unfortunately, because I wrote this book during COVID. I mean, it's just heartbreaking that I was unable to do it. So I'm hoping to go in the next year.
What was the writing process like during COVID? Did it change at all? Did it make it harder, easier? How was that for you?
It was interesting. I'm not a person who gets derailed in writing very easily. I mean, you can tell I've written 25 books in 35 years. So I'm a pretty straightforward, move ahead kind of gal. But COVID for the first few months really did kind of knock me about a bit. I didn't have access to all the things that I usually do because I turned in The Four Winds in like February of 2020, and then we were locked down. So there was no travel, seeing girlfriends. There was nothing for a long period of time, of course. And so that, like, creatively was kind of problematic. But once I, decided, hey, I'm locked down, there is not a better time to write this Vietnam book that you've wanted to write forever. Then it was like full steam ahead, and the lockdown and the minimization of what we could do was actually a great help.
And so Marlene wants to know, have you ever uncovered something in your research for this book or for another book that you kind of haven't used yet, but decided that you wanted to see in a future book?
Well, actually, the best story about that, Marlene, right, is I was actually writing a book called Winter Garden. It was my first foray into, big historical fiction. It was historical and contemporary. And it was set during the siege of Leningrad in World War II Russia. And in reading that and in researching that novel, that's when I came across the story of André Dujon, this 19-year-old Belgian girl who created one of the first escape routes out of Nazi-occupied France. And and her story, obviously it was unusable for Russia, but I was so intrigued by this idea of this young woman, doing something so important, and so angry as a woman and as a historical fiction reader, that I didn't know her story, that it stuck with me. And I kept waiting actually for someone to write a novel about it, because I kept thinking, this is an amazing novel. Someone needs to write it. And, finally I waited a couple of years and I thought, okay, I'm going to dive in and write the Nightingale. And, it was terrifying because I felt like I didn't have any historical fiction cred. So, like, who was I to write this big World War II novel? But once I uncovered that in my research, there was just no going back.
Mhm. And so someone else wants to know, what is the best piece of writing advice that you've received that you still use today while you're writing?
I mean, there's so much. I think probably the most important thing that I use on a daily basis, an editor told me years and years and years ago that your muse shows up when you sit down and start writing. And I think that's one of the most important things, because there's this sense of magic, and I guess magic is the best word, that surrounds writing. And so it's very easy to tell ourselves we need rituals, we need the perfect writing space, we need to be inspired, we need all of these things. And I have always found that if I am very workmanlike and I sit down and I don't get up until it's time to get up, sooner or later something happens, and I begin to sort of move towards that flow state that makes writing wonderful.
So further on to the next question from our audience, Maria Lou asked, she wanted to know how you picked which songs that you included in your book. She really liked hearing all the different songs that you mentioned, and it brought back a lot of memories for her. So how did you choose those?
Oh, that's so cool. Actually, I just heard today that there is the Women Spotify music list somewhere. I'm not exactly sure what that means. I'm going to have to track it down. But she's right. The music is such an important part of this book, as it was such an important part of the era. And, really, it started out in the early half of the first half of the book. It's really was from the research, the songs that meant the most, the protest songs, the anthem songs, the Vietnam War songs, and that was really, I got a lot of input from vets on what to choose. And in the second half, which more is an era more that I felt I remembered better, then I tended to use a lot of the songs that meant a lot to me personally and to my family. Songs that made me think of my mom. There's Helen Reddy, I Am Woman, and John Denver, and Jim Croce, and all the songs that my family really listened to.
Mm-hmm. And so in our audience, we have Andrew, who actually shared that he is a Vietnam veteran. He returned in 1969, and he hasn't had a chance to read your book yet, but he wanted to share that he attends weekly group meetings for veterans with PTSD. And knowing what women and nurses and doctors went through, he says he actually hasn't seen a lot in his meetings, and wanted to know if you have any insight or thoughts to why women might not be a part of these particular discussions.
Oh, that's so interesting, Andrew. Thank you. And it's interesting. All I can go by is the memoirs that I've read and the nurses that I've talked to. And one of the things you'll see, Andrew, in the book, which comes from the research, is this moment where nurses are turned away from exactly these kinds of meetings. And they were told often that the men wouldn't talk if women were there. And they just weren't set up for, PTSD was very new, if even understood at all back then. So it was very rare that they were, ready to take care of women. So I guess that's probably my answer. And it was stunning, as I was doing my research, I kept seeing over and over again, like I said earlier, women being told by vets, by the VA, by people who ought to know better, that there hadn't been women in Vietnam, when clearly there were. And in fact, there have been women in, every war we can think of. And for some reason, there was just, I think there was a layer of invisibility for the vets in general of this war. And the women were, a further level of invisibility beyond that even.
Wow. Yeah, that's really interesting. Diane Boucher, she shared that she just finished The Woman. It made her cry. She really, really loved the book. I wanted to share that. And she also saw and loved the show China Beach, which, talks about the nurses and women in the Vietnam. She wants to know if you ever saw that show and, she thought a lot of it matched. What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, I did watch China Beach back when it was on the air. And in fact, it was interesting. I tried to go and watch it while I was doing the research for this, and I couldn't find it on Netflix or Amazon or anywhere. So maybe this book will, put it back on the air, because it was a really interesting show that I don't know could be made today for network. And as far as, it was different sort of in what its point was. But it was a female-driven, nurse-driven Vietnam hospital show, and it was great. Dana Delaney was awesome.
Mm-hmm. And so another attendee wants to know, what was the greatest challenge that you encountered while writing this book?
Well, the greatest known advantage issue that I had in writing it was this terrible fear that here I was writing this historical novel that I felt was so important and so needed to be written, and would be read by people like Andrew, who would know a lot more than I did and who had experienced a lot more. And so my fear that I would not get it right, that I would be inauthentic, that was probably, the most difficult part. And like I said earlier, I didn't think so much of the broader implications of the book. I just thought this is a really important story and it needs to be told. It wasn't until I started meeting the nurse veterans and their families that I really understood how important this book could be. Had I known that, I might have been too afraid to even take it on.
So Kristen Carey wants to know, of all the characters that you have created, is there one who stands out to you that you would turn to for guidance and life advice if given the chance?
Well, I don't know about guidance for life, since they are all sort of me. So I pretty much have a handle on what they know. I can tell you that my favorite character so far is Frankie, the protagonist from The Women. I loved a lot about her. I loved her idealism, her patriotism. I loved how she, especially when she was struggling with PTSD, how she continued to fight to be standing and to take care of herself and her friends. So I really loved all of that. But since that's the book that's out now, I feel like I should pick something else that feels less self-serving. So I'm going to say probably Kate from Firefly Lane, because she was my mom. And as I said earlier, I lost my mom early, and I miss her, and I would love to be able to sit down with the real world Kate and talk to her again.
Mm-hmm. So this is a kind of a related question in a way from Janice Hall. She asked, do you become the character so you can kind of make the characters' feelings real in the story? So do you ever have kind of moments where you feel so connected to your characters that, you feel like you're in their shoes? Do they become a part of you, or are you a part of them?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I mean, obviously, it takes me a long time to craft the character that you see. The character that you see, whether it's Isabel or Vian or whoever, they start life very differently. And through, a lot of writing and a lot of editing, they become sort of their own characters. They begin as sort of, I think, maybe mouthpieces for me to some extent. But they do really become their own people as I put them through the things that they live through. And I think that, like in life, adversity reveals character. So the more my characters have to deal with, the sharper they become.
Another one now from Mary Crotty from Natick. She said, I have to admit, I binge read your book over the weekend and every night since I've had vivid dreams. And
Oh,
so she wants to know if you've had any dreams as you wrote the book. Like, is it keeping you awake at night? Does your book does it stay in your memories and does it really stick with you in the same way it does with readers?
that is so interesting. I do not dream about my books, which is, now that I think about it, kind of odd. I hear a lot. I mean, when Diane, the nurse, first read my book, the first thing she did was reach back and say, I had such terrible nightmares last night about Vietnam. I haven't had them in 20 years, so I'm not going to be able to read your book at night. And I've heard that from a lot of people, that they, have nightmares reading certain parts of it, especially I think if it hits home. But for me, I guess I'm constantly, creating it in my head and living with it. And for some reason, I guess I just let it go at night. I'm glad. It would be terrible if I had, spent 3 years haunted by my own book.
Yeah. And so Jeff Greenwald wanted to know what kind of character do you find the hardest to write and why? And is there any character, in The Woman that you think was a harder for you to write?
There were moments in The Women where Frankie was one of the most difficult characters I've had to write. And that's because the characters that are easiest for me, not surprisingly, are the characters who are like me. Characters who make, moral decisions and who have the same worldview that I do and want the same thing that I do and believe in the same kind of right and wrong that I do. When a character deviates from that and does something that I feel is immoral or does something that puts them in extreme risk that I think is not a smart decision, these kinds of characters are hard for me. For example, Tully from Firefly Lane was very difficult. She was very outside, my comfort level of what I could do realistically, but she still was fun to write.
Mm-hmm. And so we have so many people in the comments asking about what's next for you. Of course, people love your book, so they want to hear, are you working on anything new? What can you share?
I wish I could share it right now. I would really like to be working on something else right now, but I've actually found it a little bit difficult to follow The Women because this book means so much to me. And so I'm a little off on this one. So in other words, no, I don't have anything. I need a new idea. I'll see what's next with everybody else.
Mm-hmm. And so Maria Lou asked, and a couple of people chimed in on this, that she loved Julia Whelan's narration of your audiobook, and she wants to know, do you have choice in the narrators, and what are your thoughts on that, and how do you bring those voices to life?
Well, that's a question for Julia.
Yeah.
But she is amazing. I was fortunate enough, I think about a year ago, to meet Julia. So Julia has done The Great Alone, The Four Winds, and now The Women. And it's remarkable. I mean, the level that she prepares, how invested she is. And in fact, I did an event with her about The Women in LA, I think, just 2 weeks ago. And they asked me to read, and I don't read. And so she, piped up, I read. And so she did. So she read a passage, and I just sat there listening to her inhabit every character's voice and just bring this to life, where maybe in my mind it's like a guitar solo. She's like a symphony. And it's really fascinating. And one thing I have seen over and over again at my events is she has a huge following. I mean, people actually follow her and the way she does things. So I feel very lucky to have her. And yes, I do have a say in that. So as long as she will have me, I will have her.
That's amazing. A lot of people want to know kind of some of the behind the scenes details to the writing process. Brian asked, what advice or cautions would you give to a writer seeking to get published for the first time?
Can you ask Brian like where he is in the process? Like has he written something? I mean, I think in general, the important thing about writing is first of all to, commit to it, to begin it, to do it on a regular basis, and to have a thick enough skin to continue through a lot of failure. And if you're actually at the point where you've spent a fair amount of time writing a book, you have found a critique group or gotten a good editor and edited it, to the nth degree, and you think you're ready to actually try to enter the publishing process, then my advice is to put your researcher cap on and start looking at who agents and edits the books that you love, the books that you think are like yours. Try to network by there are amazing writers' conferences. And so try to meet other writers and, sort of share the journey.
We're getting even more questions that have to do, with your writing process. How do you gain perspective on your own writing? Do you, is there an editorial process that you really like go through besides just, having an editor? Are there specific people that read your books? How does it work that you know that this is exactly the book that you want to put out there?
Well, I actually stop editing when my publisher requires me by contract deadline to turn the book in, because otherwise I would do it forever. I am a very collaborative writer in the sense that I really, I seek out other opinions and information, and I try to get as many people reading something, because I find that almost everyone, I don't care what their perspective is, will give you something that matters. They may not fix a problem for you, but they identify problems. And so the way I work is I have a good friend. Her name is Megan Chance. She's a historical novelist also. We have been best friends and sort of critique partners for 35 years. And she is always the first person who reads anything. So we talk about the idea, we, hammer that out together on both of our books. I write 100 pages, I give it to her. Routinely, she says, of this 100 pages, I think 28 are pretty good. And those 28 are never contiguous. So they're pieces here and pieces there. And so I start over and I get to page 150, and we continue that process until I finally get to the end. And then I have 3 or 4 readers that I send to and get input back. And then it goes to my editor and my agent, and they weigh in. I usually do about 3 edits with my publishing editor, who is brilliant. And that's about all the time I have. Then it's time pretty much to say, okay, we like to put a book out, Kristin, please give it to us.
And so one attendee asked, they said that they were a nurse in Vietnam, and they found the surgical scenes very accurate, and they wanted to know who advised you, and where do you learn this from? I'm sure that's a great thing to hear. Yeah.
Yes, that is wonderful. So I will credit, her name is Beth Parks, a fabulous woman up in Maine, and Diane Carlson Evans, the nurse, the Army nurse, said, I think you really need someone to check these surgeries. And so she hooked me up with Beth Parks, who read the book a couple times and was a remarkable help. So thank you. I will tell her you said that.
So there are several people that really, enjoyed that story that you told about your mother and were really touched by it. They wanted to know what happened with that book that you were writing. Did it get finished? Is it going to be a book one day?
Well, so I actually wrote the first page of that book the day she died. And I did not, obviously she was not able to read it, but I was able to tell her that I had started the book. And I know that made her very happy. And I actually moved about, I don't know, 10 years ago or something. And I found the manuscript of that original book that I had written, during my pregnancy. And it was in a box, all printed off in the old dot matrix paper, And I wrote across the top of the box, "Do not publish even after my death, period." So it's there, it exists, but certainly I would hope that no one ever reads it.
That's wow. I'm sure there are plenty of people that want to read it, even if you don't
I'm
want.
sure they
Uh,
wouldn't once they read it.
so going away from your own books, what are you reading right now?
Well, I just started the new Tammy Hoag, Bad Liar. Tammy is a longtime friend, and I'm a big fan of her suspense novels. I just finished Chris Whitaker's All the Colors of the Dark, which is coming out in April. And I almost always recommend his previous book, We Begin at the End, which I loved. Um, Chasing Hope, Nick Kristof's new memoir, love that. And a really neat World War II book called Cold Victory by Carl Marlantes, who wrote the great Vietnam book Matterhorn.
Mhm. And so Eric kind of similarly wants to know, but who are some of authors that you really admire and enjoy and that you kind of look to as, people that you're really inspired by?
Well, there's, obviously there's so many and they've changed over time. When I first began, the three novelists who really sort of spoke to me and somehow touched me and showed me what I could dream of were, interestingly enough, Stephen King, Anne Rice, and Pat Conroy. And it seemed like they were an odd collection in the beginning, but now what I see is these are three authors who wrote epic novels with really deep characterizations and amazing world building and sense of time and place and beautiful language. And those are the three things that I always wanted most in my own work.
Hmm. And so someone, wanted to know when you finish a book, do you have difficulty letting the character go?
I hear this question all the time. No, I do not have any
Wow.
because you take Frankie and Barb and Ethel in this book, because this book is really, the beating heart of this book is friendship. And there's this relationship between these three women. And so, I mean, I lived with them all the time, woke up thinking about them, went to bed thinking about them, wrote scenes that did and didn't appear in the book, explored their whole lives for 3 years. And at the end of that, I am ready to move on, to something else. I really want to get to a point with a book where I feel that I have accomplished as much of my vision as I can. And once I get to that point, I am willing to say, have a good life. It's been great. I'm going on to whatever comes next. I know this is tough for readers because they always want sequels of my books. They always want the characters to go on. And I just don't have anything more to say about my characters than I've already said.
Hmm. And so Darlene said that she loves your books, and when she reads them, it really inspires her to learn more about women in history. She wants to know what your favorite book was to write, if you have one.
Oh, it's this one. But before that, I would say my favorite book to write, I have two: Winter Garden. And the reason I enjoyed writing Winter Garden so much was there was a part of this story that was disguised as a fairy tale. And that allowed me, for really the only time in my career, to write a version of fantasy. And I absolutely loved that. And then the other one would be Firefly Lane, because that was the book where, when I hit 40, I came to this moment where I missed my mom so much, and there was nowhere to find her. We didn't have a lot of family photos. There wasn't a way to get there. And so I did what I do, which is I write my way into anything. And so I created this novel that was really my way of finding out what does it feel like to go through that illness, as a mother. And at the end of it, I felt that I had found her. And interestingly enough, I started the book at the same age she was when she was diagnosed, and I finished at the same age she was when she died. So I feel like she was there with me. So those are the two.
Wow. And, while writing your books, are there any ways that you're really inspired around you in making these characters? Do you feel the woman in your life really, as you're kind of saying? I know you've mentioned a bit of it, but do you feel them coming into your book and coming into these characters and personifying them?
I don't know. It's a strange alchemy for me because it's my imagination, but it's all grounded in research. And then everything has to go through this editing process that I do that is so intense. I mean, I throw away literally hundreds of pages trying to find exactly the story that I'm trying to tell. So they kind of reveal themselves to me in different ways, but primarily through editing.
Hmm. And so with this book, what are you most proud of with it being out in the world? What's your proudest thing about having this book and writing this book? What do you feel most proud of?
You know what? I got a text today from Diane Carlson Evans, my nurse advisor. And most of the people who have advised me on this have been getting inundated with, emails and texts and phone calls from people because all of their names are in the book. And a lot of their friends are our fellow sister vets. And her text said, I am so glad I am alive to see this moment and to have, you shine this light on my sister vets. And I would say that is absolutely far and away the proudest moment of this whole book.
Hmm. And what do you hope readers take away from this book? If you had to have one thing that they leave the last page thinking, or what do you really hope that they feel or gather from this novel?
Well, as in an artistic sort of sense, I hope this is a novel that they can't put down about a woman they can't forget. I hope it teaches something to them about a period that they may not have lived through, or they may have lived through and seen through different eyes. And then I hope that it is yet another reminder, as I said before, that we need to do a better job of caring for our veterans. And so anything I can do to help in that, I think is important.
So it's at that time where we have to wrap up. Thank you so
No.
much, Kristin, for this great conversation. It was such a pleasure.
Thank you so much. This was absolutely wonderful. And thank you so much for the questions, guys, and thanks for joining us.
Yes, thank you so much to everyone for joining in tonight's conversation. Good night, everyone, and thank you so much for all your questions and for joining us tonight.